In order to capture the atmosphere and grand scale of the world created by J.R.R. Tolkien, the game development team took painstaking measures to deliver an authentic online recreation of a living, breathing Middle-earth.
Well, certainly one of our biggest challenges is taking what is, depending on the version you have, 1,400 pages of text and translating that to an immersive world and to an interactive game. And that's very challenging, for a lot of reasons. It's challenging because, the great thing about a book is that everybody has their own vision of what their reading looks like. So the first thing is identifying what are the commonalities? What are things that pretty much anyone who reads the book is going to come to expect? How do we create a world in which you do what a gamer wants to do, which is explore and interact with this world and with this story, and at the same time make sure that it feels like it's in the world, in the time, in the story that you come to expect. So when we are reading through the books and we're looking at all the literature and doing our research, there are so many kinds of cues in the text itself for how we build this world. Tolkien has created the most detailed, rich, deeply described place in existence that doesn't actually exist, to the point that it really feels like it exists. We have this huge place with tons of richness and depth that we wanted to explore for years and years to come, with our community. What we did is decide on the lands of Eriador, which is really where the Fellowship spends most of their time in the first books. Everything that we do starts from what did Tolkien write, what world did he create, what was his intention behind creating that world. And we make sure that whenever we're in places that were specifically described by Tolkien in the books, that we're representing them in a way that's true to his vision of what that particular place looked like. If you really look at Tolkien and why is that story the most popular fantasy of all time, it's a lot because the world he tried to create is one that's believable. That's under everything that we do, so that when you're walking around our Middle-earth, it feels like a real place. It's familiar to you, not just because you recognize it from the books, but because it feels a lot like the world that you experience day to day. But it's got this extra sort of expansive enhancement to it. There's a lot of places that people are going to recognize, very famous landmarks from the books that you're going to see early on. You're going to be at the Prancing Pony, which is in Breland and where Strider and the Hobbits first meet. You're going to be at the top of Weathertop, having your own encounter with Black Riders and Wraiths the same way that Aragorn does. You're going to end up in Rivendell at Elrond's house, and you're going to explore that house. You'll go to the Barrow Downs and, in fact, go deep into the Great Barrows, which are described in quite a bit of detail in the books. You'll go to Tom Bombadil's house in the edge of the Old Forest. There are a lot of sort of iconic representation of places that are well known from the books. One of the things that's been great in working with Tolkien Enterprises is that they've really given us freedom to expand on the lore and expand on what Tolkien wrote. The biggest example of this is Angmar and all the areas inside of Angmar. What would happen if, the Witch King basically created Angmar again and rose this to power? So we were able to create Carn Dûm, which is something which is just briefly mentioned, a huge palace, fortress, evil fortress in Angmar. What does Angmar look like? Nobody really knows. He talks about what Angmar did. He talks about the evil that comes from there, but he didn't describe it. So we decided Angmar should be dark, jaggy, obsidian with lots of angles and, very ominous and different looking than anywhere else in Middle-earth. And we were able to pretty much create that from scratch, but it's a place that did exist. The tools that the world builders have to work with are instrumental, really. We couldn't do what we do without it.
World Builder is a great tool. It allows us to do basically everything we need to build the Lord of the Rings online, to put this world together. We can manipulate the height map on the fly, we can paint terrain textures, we can place assets, we can place game content, we can adjust time of day, we can set up animations or starting idle animations. So when you go into a monster camp, a drake isn't just standing there, he's actually chewing down on his latest catch that he found off in the fields. We actually have real constellations off in our night sky. And so because the tool is so robust, it's allowed us to efficiently create a game of this scale to a high level of quality.
So for a game of this complexity, and especially something where we are working with iconography that, is so recognizable to people who've read the books, it's even more important for us to really have a clear picture of where we're headed before we go build any part of the world. Concept art is important for any kind of, game design that's very graphic intensive, and certainly places that rely on a large landscape like this. For us, it's been absolutely essential because it's where that translation, interpretation happens between what is in the books and what we're actually going to build in the game environment that we're creating. And what we want to be able to do is have the experimentation happen on paper. And there's flexibility in the concept art that gives us ability to play with not only structurally how it looks, but what's the mood, what's the tone of this area. We need you to draw Rivendell, and all we know is that water elements are really important. It needs to be magical and beautiful and gorgeous and lush. The rest, up to you. It gives us one thing to focus on that we can all circle around to end up where we think we're headed for that particular area. And then that becomes the blueprint for all the work that comes after that and actually bringing that to life. We have some unbelievably talented concept artists here. They have somehow encapsulated the spirit of what Tolkien was describing in terms of tone and architecture, the history of Middle-earth, which, we filled their brains with all kinds of things about the way the architecture would be, and then their own investigation of how things looked in England and in other pastoral places around the world that Tolkien would have drawn from. Every one of our concept art pieces that we use, mechanically to build the game is really something that's a piece of fine art that you could hang on the wall. In fact, we do that here. There's a gallery in the studio here where we line the walls with the art that's been drawn by some of these concept artists and other artists in the building. I mean, it's just unbelievably detailed, phenomenal work. We think we've built the richest online world that has ever existed, and we feel like this has always been a goal for us because to not do that for Middle-earth would be a huge lost opportunity.
So as the players walking through our recreation of Middle-earth, I'd really like them to think that we got it right.
The Lord of the Rings Online Shadows of Angmar offers you the chance to truly experience the grand fantasy world created by J.R.R. Tolkien, to move through the world of Middle-earth freely, and to join the Free Peoples as they face the shadows of evil that threaten to engulf the world. The rich diversity of Middle-earth's inhabitants was an aspect of the lore that the team felt was integral to the game's sense of authenticity.
What's very interesting when you're building this kind of game is we're building the world, we're building all the NPCs in the world, we're putting all the monsters in the world, and it feels until you get to beta like something's missing. What's missing is really the people that are populating Middle-earth, because those people are the players. Until we have players in the game, it's almost like you're creating an environment missing the main component that isn't there yet. So, obviously the population of Middle-earth in Lotro is all the players that have come to play, and everybody in Middle-earth is among the free people of Middle-earth that are trying to fight Sauron and trying to fight the Witch King and trying to hold back, all the evil that's threatening this wonderful land that's been here for thousands of years. And part of a war that's kind of been going on forever. So they're part of this history. And I think what's going to be interesting is that, when the players get into the game, they're going to start creating their own history.
The free peoples of Middle-earth are essentially the four races that have, over the course of Middle-earth's history, stood up to Sauron and fought back against him in one way or another. So they're men, hobbits, elves, and dwarves.
We've expanded that a little bit. While that core four are what the players are able to play, we've expanded it slightly. We've also just taken and had different races of men, which is a very Tolkien thing. And so players will be encountering them, and we tried to give them a distinct style. We have the hillmen who show up, and they have a sort of more of a tribal look, while people in Breland have a little bit more of the Tudor style housing and things like that.
We also have the Hobbits. The Hobbits are primarily from the Shire. They're the typical standard Hobbit. Happy folk who would much rather be drinking, smoking pipes, and eating food than adventuring out in the countryside. The elves are primarily from Rivendell, which is their major home, of course. And of course, we still have the elves that we have in Erdluin at the foot of the Blue Mountains. We also have the dwarves.
Dwarves are a race of craftsmen and miners and warriors who live beneath the mountains of Middle-earth and are constantly at war with the goblins and orcs who also live down there.
By paying close attention to the design of the equipment that the players are wearing, along with what NPCs wear and everything, you're trying to present a world. And by having such a consistent design, you are able to not do anything that detracts or takes the player out of that world. You're trying to immerse them in it. So that's what we try to accomplish with our art design.
The costume design comes from a lot of different areas from history, definitely from kind of the Viking Norse mythology area. Tolkien was definitely fascinated in the whole Norse Celtic folklore. And so when I'm designing a lot of the characters, you want to have rich detail but at the same time be pretty subtle with it. The guidance I got from the Tolkien world is you definitely get a feeling of each culture that you go to. The Hobbits definitely feel kind of Victorian in style. They definitely have a very unique feel to them, more proper in the way they dress. With the elves, definitely more spiritual. They talk about some of their clothing being whitish and bluish in tones, and so we definitely pay attention to those details as well. The dwarven designs, we definitely want to go the route of very Celtic. We definitely have that feeling of the geometry that the Celts used in the dwarven designs, because it's very much more masculine, and then the humans are much more utilitarian in their style.
The tricky part with clothing for players is that it's meant to be infinitely flexible. Anybody can wear anything, and unless they try really, really hard, they can't make themselves look either just terrible or, completely out of place in the world. So it's making things all fit together in a way that makes sense.
The hardest thing to do probably in this game is to figure out how you're going to make somebody feel as though they're a part of Middle-earth. We have to come up with a way that you're actually making some kind of an impact on the world. So through our epic story, I think the main focus has always been finding a way to get you involved and make you feel as though you're a hero in your own right and the things that you've done.
And we've got a lot of people who want to role play this specific world and this specific story, so I imagine all kinds of player histories that are going to be intertwined with, the histories that we know of the world. And then it'll begin to feel more and more like this really is the free people of Middle-earth, and there really is a war going on, and we're all in this together to fight this war.
Man and elf, hobbit and dwarf, the free peoples of Middle-earth all come to life in The Lord of the Rings Online, Shadows of Angmar. Another important aspect of the books of J.R.R. Tolkien is the attention paid to weaponry and armor. The game designers felt it was important to recreate that same degree of attention when creating the weapons used in the game.
Another huge part of the assets that we have to create for the game is equipment. One of the really exciting things to players is to differentiate themselves from other players, right? What makes me unique in the world is what makes it fun for me, to distinguish myself from everybody else. Another part of it is, how does my avatar look? And that's influenced a lot by the armor that I wear, the equipment that I wield. And so there's a prideful aesthetic version to all the equipment that I acquire, as well as what's going to make me stronger and cooler. So we have literally thousands of items that we've created, tons and tons of armor sets, and all of this had to be influenced by the lore. There's different classes of armor, not just in terms of gameplay, but also in terms of aesthetics. That there is armor that exists in Middle-earth that is old, Western-esque armor that was built in the Second Age, where men were better craftsmen than they are now. But that is fancy stuff that you might have gotten a hold of because you found it, not because someone's actually building it for you. So it's slightly older looking. There's armor that was crafted by the dwarves in their heyday. It's dwarven crafted. It's not only for dwarves. Anybody can wear it. There's armor that was crafted by the elves in their heyday. This is all armor that we know how it got here. And then from that, we know what the style needs to be, how they should look, making them look as beautiful as possible. And then adding on top of that, how do we make them as variable as possible? So we work some technology into it so that we can actually dye certain portions of the armor, different colors, to give it variety, to give it more interest.
I've designed a lot of different armors and clothing that will definitely allow a character to feel very, very individual in the game and feel very distinct and separate in design and feeling from all the other characters that they come in contact with. And we're constantly working on ways to improve that through dye mapping, which is basically being able to change the color of your armor, and that adds another area to distinguish your armor against someone else's armor. So you might be the guy that has the full red suit of armor, where the other guy is like a mixture of green and blue.
We have a wide variety of weapons that we allow players to use in Lord of the Rings Online. Of course, we try to use as many examples from the books as we can, so we have a variety of weapons that were present in medieval Northern Europe, which was the inspiration for a lot of Tolkien's work. So you see a lot of swords, one- and two-handed axes, which of course are favorite of the dwarves. Bows play a significant part in Tolkien's mythology. One of the lesser-known facts is that a lot of hobbits were actually very good archers, so spears, halberds, maces, and clubs. It's one of the things we try to do on the game system side is to make sure that each of those weapons has a distinctive playstyle associated with them.
They're big, they're small, some of them are very ornate, some of them are very simple and crafted simply. It really depends on what level you're playing at. So they're intended to be very detailed and realistic looking. We don't have a lot of weapons that are just crazy, out there, unbelievable. It's meant to be a weapon that feels like it's something you could actually use. Which isn't to say we don't have lots of really big hatchets and axes and things that, look disproportionately large to the person that's carrying them. We just assume that dwarves and people in Middle-earth are extra heroic and can carry things that are really big like that. There are also magical weapons in the game, which are really exciting in a couple of ways. Magical in that they resist certain types of attacks. Also magical in that they have detect and other types of things on them. Very similar to Bilbo's sting, which can detect the presence of orcs. So those are very cool. Everybody likes magical weapons.
Ultimately, this is a fantasy world, so we don't have any historical records of what a weapon that looks like if it's been forged by a dwarf or an elf. And in those cases, we take a little bit of fantastic license to create some really spectacular looking weapons.
Middle-earth is filled with legendary weapons and armor of great power. The heroes of the Lord of the Rings Online will have the chance to wield those that are the equal of Glomdring, Anduril, and Sting. The books of J.R.R. Tolkien showcase a menagerie of creatures that populate the world, and in the land of Middle-earth, monsters play as much of a role as heroes do.
Another big opportunity for iconic characters in the game are the monsters.
Tolkien created some of the most iconic fantasy bad guys. The type of evil that is represented by the monsters in Middle-earth is perhaps different than in other fantasy. Their lack of nobility is a better way to explain how bad these guys are.
Evil's a big part of any big fantasy, any big struggle, the struggle between good and evil. And I think we can say that one of the things that Tolkien did really well is create, again, really believable evil. Evil that was rooted in some kind of reality that made sense. These are the original of all these types of characters.
You've seen them in everything afterwards. It's kind of interesting. There's sort of a dividing line between when Tolkien wrote and when everything came after. Orcs became standard in fantasy. The reason why is just how well they were portrayed as completely debased, corrupt, irredeemable. That's an orc.
When we were making the list for the monsters that were going to be in Lord of the Rings Online, we basically went through the books and jotted down every monster that was ever mentioned, even if it was just one time.
We're trying to make sure that monsters are where they should be, right? Where they're expected to be. And that really helped us hone it down to the approximately 40 iconic monsters that we needed to create.
We have the familiar Tolkien monsters. We have orcs, goblins, trolls, Orcs, wolves, spiders, and we've also, fortunately, had the ability with orcs and goblins to do varieties of different, because they're described as being very different in appearance. The orcs aren't one homogeneous sort of look. There's big orcs and small orcs and skinny orcs, so we had that variety.
When it comes to orcs, I really view the orcs as corrupted elves. So I really wanted to make them look like that at one point they were elves. In the books, they don't go into great lengthy description about how each orc looks. And you definitely get a feel for the attitude in the orcs, but there's still a lot to play with.
Orcs they're the foot soldiers. They're the ones that are out there cleaving heads. They are the main force that both Sauron and, to a certain extent, Saruman ended up using throughout the books.
And then we started looking at what are the monsters that we want to create. And that was driven more by which areas feel like they need more scary things to fight against.
A troll that we came up with called the Gertrug, and that's a monster that was described briefly in the books. Basically, Saruman wanted to make a smarter troll. So we created that character as well, and he's huge, and he has a little bit more of an intelligent look in his eye than what you would get from a normal troll.
We have a creature known as the Knickerbreaker, which is manifested within swamps and other really nasty locations of the world. As they're mostly insect-like, they burrow into the ground and they will do other things to confound any form of players who happen to get near them. They're midges. One of the things, they're insect swarms that the Fellowship encountered when they were actually moving through the swamps outside of CÓMO and Archit.
Which parts of our world feel like they just need a totally different feel or flavor, right? And then we sat to concepting those and created those as well.
We want to expand on all that because we need as many monsters in our game as possible for variety.
A character, we would find their descriptions of what they looked like, copy those descriptions out, put them together, and hand that to a concept artist.
As a concept artist, my job is specifically to create monsters, characters for the world of Lord of the Rings. And I keep in mind culture, costume, the demeanor of each character. When I design a character, I first start off with a sketch, and then I develop that into a silhouette that looks good, so that's recognizable in the game. And then once that gets approved, I get into the real meat of the design and flesh it out into a final drawing. Then I will make an orthograph, which is basically a tool to help production artists get the right proportions of the character that I draw. So I will do a blueprint, a front, a back, and a side view of every character that I've drawn with every little detail. And then I pass those 3 drawings off to a production artist, and then they will start to use a 3D program to pull and extract a model. Eventually, when they get that all finalized, then they'll go in and add textures.
Evil is the main antagonist. That is the role that evil plays in pretty much every game. But in this game, it is the thing that is trying to destroy everything about this world. It is trying to tear it apart from the inside.
The game designers of the Lord of the Rings Online have made sure that the monsters in the game are as vivid and fearsome as the monsters in the books. While the people who inhabit Middle-earth are numerous and diverse, players will still encounter familiar faces on their journey. As the game progresses, you'll never know when familiar characters from the books will appear.
When you look at the main characters that you're expecting to see in Lord of the Rings, obviously that's a challenge for us. People have read the books, people have experienced them in different media. Everybody has a different image of what Frodo looks like, what Gandalf looks like, what Elrond looks like.
It's going to be very hard for us to say, hey, this is the ideal look of what this person is, because everybody is going to have their own understanding of what that person looked like, at least in their own mind's eye.
One of the things that's kind of cool is just how quickly people recognize the iconic characters from the book. We make sure that they are all presented in a very iconic setting. So you know that the man in the gray hat with the big beard and robe, that's obviously Gandalf, not just by what he looks like, but by the things that he says and the things that he does. He's very obviously a powerful character, and we make sure that we craft every environment around a major story character to make the most of that character.
So they really fit into two categories. The first category are people that are described in implicit detail by Tolkien, like Gandalf. If you really read the book and follow specifically what he says about Gandalf, and then you set out to draw Gandalf, he's pretty much always going to look the same, which is great, which is why he's so iconic. On the other hand, with characters like Frodo or Sam, how do you differentiate between the two? We know what hobbits look like. We have a basic idea of age and sort of what their trade is, and that gives us some idea. But then it's really more focused on what is the nature of that character rather than what their physical attributes are. And that really impacts more how the character is drawn, how the character is created. And then the biggest thing that defines them is where they are and what they do and how they interact with things.
It's very hard to mistake the fact that when you're in the presence of someone like Gandalf the Grey, that this is an important being inside of this world. When you meet Aragorn for the first time, he is a battlefield commander. He's not just some guy that you talk to once. He's someone that's trying to get you to go out there and do something that he absolutely needs to have done. From the very beginning, you can tell he is an iconic character. He is one of the leaders of this world.
Elrond's another one, right? He talks about some of him specifically down to what color of some of the pieces of his clothing are. But then he really just says things like, he appears wise, and he appears that he's been around for many, many, many years. Then it becomes to interpretation. So we have to let the players suspend that disbelief. Whatever they imagine when they're in the books with those characters, they're gonna have to kind of go along for the ride with us. And I think as long as they feel like the character, they're behaving like the way they expect, that's the most important thing.
If the only thing you've done is read the books, and even if you haven't read the books, I think it's going to be very simple for you to realize that these are the important characters. These are the movers and the shakers that are driving Middle-earth towards its climax.
The Lord of the Rings Online, Shadows of Angmar, delivers an authentic Middle-earth experience by allowing players to interact with the familiar characters from the books of J.R.R. Tolkien. Designing the main villain for The Lord of the Rings Online found the team faced with interesting choices as to how some characters' stories would be integrated with the game.
We knew that you as a protagonist needed to have your own nemesis. And Sauron's great, but it's going to be a long time before anybody's in Mordor. Who can I specifically struggle against, especially in Eriador, which is really the early part of the books. Again, we picked Angmar as the place to really focus on, and the Witch King, who is the Lord of the Nazgul. The Nazgul, who are the ring wraiths that were basically turned into wraiths by wearing the rings that were crafted and that were controlled by the One Ring. The Witch King was a very prominent feature both in the current Lord of the Rings story, and you see him in the books, especially in the later part of the trilogy, but in an earlier time in Middle-earth history, he was actually somebody who did have this vast realm in Angmar, and from that post, basically, attacked Eriador. So he seemed the perfect nemesis to resurrect during the Third Age. Very believable that this could happen. It gives you somebody really dangerous to fight against.
The Witch King will certainly play a prominent role as you journey through Middle-earth.
So the Intro Cinematic is our one real opportunity to speak to all the people that have come to see the Lord of the Rings story.
Our worst fears have come to pass. The One Ring has revealed itself.
Which is, it's about Frodo, who's taking the ring to Mordor, and explain to them how that relates to the experience that they're actually going to have. It's really important for you to understand that when you start, otherwise your expectation is just not in the right place. I have an opportunity to put you in an emotional space and a mental space before you even start playing the game. So what we basically do in the intro cinematic is say, Gandalf, who we all know is important to everyone, is talking to you and explaining to you basically that the War of the Ring is a much larger war, and that there are these things happening in Angmar and that they've happened before, and that you are going to be required to help in this struggle, and that everything that you do is going to help the Fellowship and help this struggle against Sauron.
We created drama in our intro cinematic, just I think with the story, with the script. I think you start with the script and what's the story you're trying to tell and what are you trying to tell the user. The drama comes out of heroic moments. I would say it's like a light and dark type of thing. The intro cinematic should convey to the user really what the intention of the game is.
It takes you through this experience and then drops you in that first newbie experience, which is basically now you're left with a challenge to basically start doing that, what Gandalf's talked to you about. So the intro cinematic is really our first opportunity to, tell you, look, lights are coming down, we're starting the show, take you through a short experience to sort of set your expectation and place you in the world, and off you go. So here we go.
Our worst fears have come to pass. The One Ring has revealed itself, and as the Fellowship prepares for its perilous journey to Mount Doom, the shadow of Sauron stretches forth to reclaim it. In ages long past, the Witch King gathered a dark army in Angmar. Once again, he calls a vast horde from the depths of Kandum to march upon the lands of Middle-earth and lay them to waste. Aragorn and I hoped the Rangers alone could hold back the Witch King's advance, and that Angmar's strength had not yet grown too great. We were wrong. Oh, gosh! Fight! You must unite the free peoples of Eriador and inspire them to stand against Sauron. For if you do not oppose the army of Angmar, then all the lands of Middle-earth will fall forever into darkness and shadow. War is at hand. The time is now.